Hi, I'm Callum from Retro Power. Since 2020 we've been doing a weekly walk around our workshop called the Uncut series, where we show the progress on the various projects we're working on. We thought it would be really cool if we edited together all the segments that relate to each individual project into one series, so you can actually follow the build of an individual project start to finish. So that's what we've done. Welcome to the Dream Car Build series.
The Chevette. Gaz has been working on the body kit fitment. He's made various bits of progress on that. It's moving forward. He's been doing brackets for the bumpers. We've just done some brackets. I've helped him do some brackets for the front bumper this morning to get that lined up. Modifications to the wings are getting there now. He's modifying the headlamp apertures now to get them the right shape so we can actually fit headlamps in it. They're not going to be standard headlamps, so there's various work we've got to do to that area. And he's then also doing bits of prep on the wings, just fettling, tidying up the mounting holes and all the mounting flanges and filling those to fit the car. All the fun work with fiberglass to make sure everything fits. That's progressing steadily. There'll be quite a lot more of that work to do, but that's progressing steadily moving forwards. Once a bit more work has been done on the kit, probably next week I think, this will be going back into, you guys will take the kit off so he can then carry on with some of the fiberglass prep work on that, while the car goes back into the metal shop so Scott can put it on the rotisserie, because he's going to be moving on to seam brazing it all. He's going to seam braze. We TIG braze all the seams on the car. We clean them and then we TIG braze them with a copper alloy rod, with a silicon bronze rod. And then there's various bits of welding to finish off. Few more tasks to do. We've got to put some gussets on the roll cage. Various tasks. We've got to pull the engine and gearbox out. They're still in at the moment. They've got to come out to enable us to do various bits of finishing in the engine bay, finish off he's almost done it, but it's just a tiny bit to finish off on the dry sump tank receiver fabrication in the inner wing. So we'll be getting on with that next week as well. But this is getting close now to the end of metal work, but there is still quite a bit of dry build work to do. We've got to do provisions for things like the quarter cards inside, the various bits of plumbing provisions still to go into it. So there's a chunk of work still to do in the metalwork workshop, but not actually that much normal metalwork per se. So we're getting through that now. That's progressing. Just a lot more fiberglass dust to generate yet.
The Chevette, Scott's been on this week. A lot of what he's been on so far has been bonnet pins and boot pins. So on the back we've gone for these little flush push button releases, which are a really neat solution. I'm always a little concerned about the security of the latch. I probably wouldn't, or I wouldn't typically use them on a bonnet. I'm sure there are plenty of people who do, but I wouldn't want to risk it with no safety on the bonnet. With the boot, if it comes unlatched, it's not the end of the world, but they are pretty good. And they're basically a little stainless steel ball joint that clicks into the back of a billet housing, and you push it and it releases, and then when you click it back down, it locks back into place. Now it's a little bit more of a complicated job than you might think, because the boot frame interferes with this area, and because the billet housing has to go through a relatively thin skin, you can't extend it through the inner frame as well. And it doesn't look very tidy if you just leave a ragged hole in the inside frame. So what we've done is put a large hole on the inside frame and then essentially fabricate a cylinder that extends that up to the outer skin with a gap in the side of it there. So the inner frame actually steps out to the outer skin, and the two are pinched together by that billet piece with the lock nut on the back of it. Just makes a really neat job of it, and then the receptacles that he's fabricated here slot into that gap in the frame that he fabricated. Now before getting onto that, he also needed to ascertain the position for those, and there's a spoiler going on here, so we did a trial fit of that spoiler and also made provision for the bolts on that. They're typically just bonded on and smoothed out, and we didn't really want to do that. As with all the body kit, we're leaving it completely separate, so it's all going to be bolt-on panels. And what we generally do is actually remold the back, the mating face of those panels by applying just parcel tape in our case onto the body, applying a layer of filler onto the back of the panel, fiberglass filler, and then actually fitting them into place. So they actually take a mold of the shape of the car to make sure they're a perfect fit. And he's done that on the spoiler this week, and also then put holes in for riv nuts on the back, and reinforce the areas on the spoiler where the bolts are going to go through and countersunk them, so that once that spoiler prep work's all done, it'll literally just be a bolt-on panel. And he needed to get that done before doing those so we could make sure the position was right. On the front, also pins on the front. Now it's aero catches on the front. You've probably seen them, these little oval shaped flush fitting latches, if you like, where you push a little release, the lever flips up, and then you can open the bonnet. And they're probably a more secure fitting than the ones we use on the boot, because there's a pin that actually goes through a hole, so it can't really fail. And the latch, there's 2 stages to the latch, so short of something actually breaking, they're very unlikely to fail. Now on the front ones, we needed to put them behind the frame, otherwise they would end up partially cut into the reinforcement frame of the bonnet, which would look untidy. So we put them just as far forward as we could get them without interfering with that frame. And that then means that the pins end up quite a long way back. So it was trying to come up with a neat way. If you imagine this wasn't here, which it wasn't before, the pins are sort of hovering in free space a long way away from any structure. So we did a few ideas. We thought about completely encasing in this corner. We thought about doing some tubular structure from down here. None of it seemed that pleasing, so we came upon the idea of making it almost look like a corner with a triangular cutout in it. And so we've just done a folded little channel section with the downward fold that matches the downward fold on the back of this slam panel, and then carried that on in it with a rounded corner. So by the time this is all prepped out and painted, it's almost going to look as if that is part of that front panel, and there's essentially just a triangular cutout in there. So that's looking really neat. We've been doing a little bit of design work on the lights for this car. I'll probably touch more on that another time. We're going to do our own interpretation of the early style headlights that were sort of recessed, but with a billet machine surround and Hella projector units, xenon projector units that are going to go in there. And we're going to do our own rear light design as well, but we'll look at that a bit more next week.
Moving on to Chevette. We've, as you can see, the car's now on a rotisserie. This has enabled the next round of work, the sort of final round of body shell work to be undertaken. I just need to check my list just to double check. Yeah, the first and most important one was the finishing of all the underside wells, because the car had been on a jig and then on a trolley and briefly on the ramp, but all of that time basically underside pointing downwards. Most of the grinding and trimming and tidying work is pretty unpleasant done that way up. So Scott's made up the mounts, mounted it onto the rotisserie, so he can spin that round, trim off and dress all of the underside welds and tidy the whole underside of the car and get it all looking decent, making sure any little bits of weld finishing that were under there have been done. There's a few jobs like the front edge of the 4 link boxes, the actual trailing link boxes, the front edge of those where it protrudes through the floor needed skidding into the drop section of the floor pan ahead of them. So that's now been done. Just check my list again, make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, the bulkhead needed a little bit of modification. The water outlet on the rear of the cylinder head on the C20XC Vauxhall engine is usually fouls a bulkhead in a rear-wheel drive application. They can be blanked off, and in a lot of applications they are blanked off. It's nice to keep that flow from that end of the cylinder head if possible. It's not the end of the world if you don't, but if you can keep that flow, it does keep the cylinder head temperatures more even. And it also gives you the option to run a heater from them, which we do want on this car. So that we've just done a little modification just to get us a bit more clearance on that pipe. There was room, but it was a little bit tight, and if you can get a bit more clearance, then go for it if you can. And I think that is pretty, the various little bits on the transmission tunnel that needed finishing off, particularly near the back. Again, there was some parts that were difficult to access earlier on that needed tidying. And there's also the tidying of the original factory area. I think we mentioned at the stage of blasting the car that we were quite surprised that the front tunnel section on the Chevette, on an automatic shell, this was an automatic shell, the General Motors production modification to put that tunnel in was to simply gas torch out a section of the non-automatic car's floor pan and then stitch weld in Literally, it's just MIG stitched in a pressing to clear the automatic gearbox, and the edges, the ragged flame cut edges of the original floor pan were just left, and well, they were daubed in sealer with a brush, and that was it. But they were quite ragged and not very tight. So anyway, that's all been tidied back to the step in the auto tunnel now. So that's all quite neat and much improved on how it was. And another thing, the cross members, you'll see the cross members mounted back up in the shell. That's so that we can mock up the steering column and just refine the hole in the bulkhead for the steering column to pass through. It's slightly different in the way it's different to a normal Chevette in that we're using the Corsa B electric power steering conversion, which Scott's done the mounts on the bulkhead for. That means that there is no outer column going through the bulkhead anymore. It's just the inner column which rotates. So we're actually making a little rotating seal that goes in the bulkhead for that to go through to enable it to rotate but keep the water out. So that's why that's all sort of mocked up in the shell again at the minute, is to enable us to position that accurately and get the little mounts put into the bulkhead for the rotating seal to go into. So that's work in progress still on that at the moment.
Scott this week, Chevette. Last week he was just finishing off all the underside welds on the rotisserie. He'd been doing a lot of weld grinding basically. He did some reinforced jacking points on it, which was something we discussed with the customer. We've just reinforced a section of the sill seam so you can jack it under the sill seam without damaging it. He then went through and welded up all of the redundant holes in the engine bay that were original wiring or plumbing apertures in the bulkhead, which we didn't want. So they've all been welded up and cleaned up. And at the moment he's working on the fuel tank enclosure. So we're going to have a fuel tank in the boot, which it is originally on the Chevette. But we want to do a couple of things. We want it to be much neater, and we also want it to be sealed from the rest of the cabin. So what we've done is he's made a new piece here. There was an original part slightly further forward, but it had that many little holes and details on it that we didn't need. It didn't really make sense to even try and use that and change it. So we've just got rid of that and done a completely new panel which sits further back directly between the turrets, where it's just a neater way to intersect it. And then he's in the process of building the rest of the structure around that area to support what will be a main cover panel over the top. So he's done a little panel here each side now. The next sections are these, which as you can see will be plug welded in on each side here. They need to be trimmed to length, which is already marked out. That one sits that side. As you can see, he's done a nice little joggled recess in there, mainly for visual effect, but it also stiffens the panel up a bit. That side, the shape of the quarter is actually different, so it's got a different profile on the side. But our plan is that when we've got these quarter trim panels in here, they will come down and meet it where that line is. So the visible portion will be symmetrical on both sides. And then it's just in the process of making the rear section, which will lap in underneath this original flange here on the interior of the boot. That will go all the way through and mate up against the rear panel, and you can't see it, but there's a little 90-degree flange sat in here at the minute, which has been forming to the exact shape of the rear panel. That's going to be bonded to the inside of the rear panel, and this will be spot welded to that flange, which will seal off this cavity from this fuel tank enclosure. This hole will be welded up, the smashing hole the other side will be welded up, and at that point there's no other gap into this area than just the top piece. You can see on here he's done a sort of half-inch recess, and there's going to be a matching half-inch recess spot welded all the way around that whole aperture. And once that's done, we're going to have a 12mm thick carbon Nomex honeycomb panel made, which sits down into that recess. So you'll have a nice carbon fibre panel there that's really strong. That'll be retained by means which we've yet to determine. And then the fuel tank will be underneath. And we're just going to fill the fuel tank directly in the boot on this, so there'll be a hatch in the middle of that panel that you can open up to access the fuel filler, rather than fabricating one into the quarter here as they are originally. And as we did on the grey car we built before, it just seemed simpler and cleaner on this one to fill it here, particularly as he's not too fussed about having a spare wheel. And on this car there is room to put the spare further forward because the cage doesn't inhibit that access. So that's where we're at with that. Next week, Scott should be finishing that aperture.
Yeah, Scott's been busy on this. The main single area of focus sort of last week, at the tail end of last week, was getting the fuel tank enclosure sorted out. He's now pretty much finished on that, apart from the top. That's having a carbon composite lid made for it, a carbon sandwich construction honeycomb lid. That's going to enclose the fuel tank area, but obviously all of the rest of that area needs bulkheading off to prevent sort of fuel leakage if there was a fuel tank issue, fuel tank rupture in an accident, stop that leaking into the rest of the car. So that's all been bulkheaded off all round and enclosed. There's a section been made with some swaged holes above the axle tunnel, which blanks off that area from the rest of the car. He's then formed a stepped surround that the carbon lid drops into, and then that'll be held into there by push-release fasteners, similar to the ones that hold the boot lid shut. And that then seals off where the fuel tank and the fuel pump and the fuel filter and the fuel pipe work in there will all be then sealed from the rest of the car, as it would be on a competition vehicle. It isn't a competition car, it's just a fun road car, but that area is best to build to the same sort of MSA rules anyway. That way, if the owner does decide to compete in it, then it's suitable. Same with the roll cage. If the owner does decide to use it, it's compliant anyway. And in any case, it makes it safer for road use. So that's all done now. The brace sections of the sort of centre bulkhead, I guess you could call it, that tie the link boxes into the cross tube of the cage. The cross tube's been put in. The braces that brace the link boxes to that cross tube are now in. Some punched and swaged plates in there to tie all that area together. Scott's been doing some finish welding on various parts of the shell, welding up trim holes. There's lots of self-tapper holes. I'm just looking at in the inner sills where the original door step finishes that held the carpet edges down were fitted. We're not having carpet, so they need to go, so he's doing that. The surround for the gear lever area was drawn up and CNC cut. James drew that up, got it CNC cut, and then Scott's got that on the top of the tunnel and got that spot welded on. That's designed to have a set of threaded inserts. Well, it's got a set of threaded inserts in it, so that we can screw a billet machine section down onto there, which is going to then be the final finisher around the gear lever, and finish off the rest of the tunnel top. So that's all done. The fuel filler is now redundant because the tank will be direct fill in the boot under the removable lid. So that's now redundant. So Scott's made a section, TIG welded it in there, and panel beaten that. So that's all done. He's done a bit more panel beating on the quarter panels to get them ready for the bodywork prior to the final body kit fit. He's also done a bit of rot repair on the rear panel because there was a couple of little bits we'd not got round to doing earlier on the boot aperture lip. So he's got those bits done. I'll just check my notes a minute, make sure I've got most of the other bits. I think we've got most of the things. Yeah, he's done the fitment for the oil cooler. Ah yes, power steering as well. We've got I don't know if I've mentioned that before or not now. For the power steering, this is having a Corsa B power steering motor and column, which we'd already done the mounts for the motor. However, where the column goes through the bulkhead, there's no outer column, if you like, where that goes through the bulkhead. It's just the rotating inner. We want to seal on that, so we've made a little. Scott's made a recessed section, like a piece of tube that's recessed into the bulkhead with a seal carrier that will bolt into it, and then that will ride on a section on the inner column that rotates in it to basically give us a watertight seal where the steering column goes through the bulkhead, just as a neat solution for doing that properly. We've used grommets and things previously. Decided we were actually going to use a proper wiper seal on this just to make it a little bit neater. It's also finished sorting out the oil cooler mounts, which they were done before, but there was a few bits to finish on those, and the sump guard mounts, because the car's having a sump guard. James has machined some threaded bosses, and Scott's got those TIG welded into the front cross member, the front chassis cross member that also carries the radiator. It's at that stage where there's all the finish welding going on. Lots of little bits and bobs around, lots of weld dressing underneath the car again. There's always, every time you think you've got it done, there's another 500 bits to weld dress, where little bits you need to grind back, so there's all that going on. And then the car's going to be seam brazed, so over the next few days it'll be TIG brazing, stitch TIG brazing all the seams in the whole body shell, and there's a couple of gussets to put in on the cage which have also got to be seam brazed in, so they'll be going in as well. Yeah, it's all hands to the pumps really on that, because that's basically, we're days away rather than weeks away now from that going for its final reblast, where we'll clean up all the new metal and key all that up, reblast it underneath, zinc metal spray it underneath, epoxy prime it, and it goes into the body shop to join Gary.